So we have sort of old school or classical ways of following people, of invading their privacy with warrants, searches, seizures of things, places. All this law has to be understood first and then applied in an extraordinarily ever-changing, decidedly sophisticated arena of electronic surveillance. Now, most people are aware that cell phones have GPS. We have watches, either Apple watches or Garmin watches. We use electronic surveillance on ourselves all the time. I mean, how many have ever seen a doorbell that records the camera in the doorbell where you ring it? In fact, that is one of the brand names, the Ring. There are communities connected by this. You can see cameras that are very inexpensive and almost open the box and plug them in. You can see the inside of your house, the outside of your house, movement on your cell phone with a couple taps on an app. You can find your keys. You can find your friends. You can see if you left your headphones at work or if you left them in the car. You can see how far away people are, if they're en route. You can see directions. I mean, we surveil ourselves. This is not the government intruding all the time. And it is, I mean, spy level. Your Apple Watch is spy level. Only the most highly classified CIA officers in the clandestine category would have had access to the things that we literally slap on our wrist today. But over time, law enforcement has had to sort of work out the contours, and the courts have had to answer questions created by law enforcement about what can we do, what can't we do, what can we do, and what can't we do. So electronic surveillance is not just your basic wiretap, but that's essentially where things began. So we have the ability to record people with tapes, audible. We have the ability to record people video with tapes, audible. Now that everything is digital, your phone probably has a much better digital camera than some of the most expensive digital SLR cameras that came out 25 years ago. It is just amazing that as technology progresses, law enforcement and the courts have to deal with this because we still have a constitution that is the supreme law of the land, and a constitution which is not something that can be easily amended. So we have Congress who has instigated several different opportunities for us to review these kinds of things. There are laws. We're going to look at essentially 4 laws. Keep in mind, the old concept, electronic surveillance, is generally unconstitutional only if there's a trespass. New concept, electronic surveillance is unconstitutional if it violates a reasonable expectation of privacy. That's a current law. So we've seen the reasonable expectation of privacy before. And although I don't intend to belabor this sort of joke, but the Third Amendment that has to do with quartering soldiers has an indirect but substantial argument base for this kind of protection, the reasonable expectation of privacy. Privacy is guaranteed by the Constitution, so says the Supreme Court. So what are the 4 laws that govern electronic surveillance? The first is Title III of the Omnibus, Crime Control, and Safe Streets Act of 1968. It's a long name. It's actually a very complicated law. This is otherwise known as the Wiretap Law. So the down and dirty, here's 2 things. If a court order has authorized the wiretap, then you can use a wiretap, or you can tap a wire. Or if one of the parties has consented. So you need a court order or you need consent. That's sort of the down and dirty of this law, in short. The next law is the Electronic Communications and Privacy Act, or the ECPA, of 1986. So we're moving in the history timeline down from the 60s to the 80s. So this amends Title III, and there are 2 main objectives here. 2 main objectives. The first is to safeguard private electronic communications from unauthorized government access. So it was deemed that it was not enough just to say you're not allowed to, government, but there needed to be some protections against unauthorized government access. And this essentially bans internet service providers from divulging contents of communications without the consent of the customer who originated the communication. So this is to also protect the internet service providers, the ISPs, but it bans them. It does not allow them. It would violate this federal law if they did. The next law is the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act, the Khalia Act of 1994, so from the 60s to the 80s to the 90s. And this law was enacted to keep up with the advances in technology. So in 1994, you might or might not even remember this. I do. People didn't have cell phones when I was in high school, and rarely in college, not until my graduate school were cell phones almost everywhere. My first cell phone never came out of my glove box. It was only for emergencies. Eventually, cell phones had Netflix on them, and FaceTime, and Facebook, and apps, and you have a mini computer in your pocket. But as the times were a-changing in the 1990s, Congress enacted laws to help keep up with those advances in technology. This also amends Title III, and it amends the ECPA. The main purpose here is to sort of make it even more clear, or to be crystal clear, what a telecommunications carrier's duty is to cooperate in the interception of communications for law enforcement purposes. So this does change Title III, and it does change the ECPA. So the final of the four laws, federal laws governing electronic surveillance, is Fisa, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, 1978. So this regulates the collection of foreign intelligence information. Everything from eavesdropping, wiretapping, physical entries by government agents, and pin trap orders. And there is a court, actually a court, that was created, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and that court issues FISA warrants after a hearing and after finding a probable cause that four basic conditions have been met. So this is not about necessarily law enforcement in the typical sense. This is counterintelligence, and we're talking about foreign operatives and things. But this is one of the main federal laws. So you might have seen in a TV show or in a movie, you may have heard someone say FISA, you may have seen it on the news, a FISA warrant. This is the foundational law, FISA, with the FISC, the FISC, the court that issues those warrants. And this is how the procedures are outlined. This is how you get a warrant to have all sorts of eavesdropping and tapping that goes on legally under this law of foreign assets, essentially. So what about using electronic devices in a public place? There is a limit to electronic surveillance, even if it does not directly intrude into individual privacy. What does that mean? So devices that gather information but do not intercept communication, they don't come under Title VII, nor are they governed by the Fourth Amendment reasonable expectation of privacy. So pen registers record the numbers dialed from a telephone, for instance. That's okay. There's no Fourth Amendment violation. Electronic beepers are tracking devices in public places. We mentioned GPS. As you might imagine, the Supreme Court cases that deal with developing law are more recent in time. There's a leading case so far from 2012, United States versus Jones, and it is the leading case on GPS tracking devices. And there was an issue in that case of whether the warrantless installation and use of a GPS tracking device on a motor vehicle to monitor its movement on public streets violated the Fourth Amendment. And the answer was yes. it probably does constitute a search under the Fourth Amendment. It wasn't absolutely clear from its face, though. So attaching a device without a warrant constitutes trespass. And United States versus Jones, essentially the holding was that you must have a warrant to install a GPS tracking device, even though you could essentially get an over-the-counter device for very small funds and attach it with a magnet to a car. It would be so easy for anyone to do this. You may not do that as a law enforcement officer without a warrant. So keep in mind as you're reading through this last chapter that you will likely see many more cases trying to figure out how to handle the advances in technology. I mentioned before, many of us have self-imposed surveillance all over us. We have phones, we have earbuds, we have watches, our cars are monitored by GPS, not by the government, but by contract or contractual relationship. So we have all of these things that we are doing for our own benefit and ourselves, but that means law enforcement has access to this information as well, unless there's a law that prohibits them. So I imagine over the course of your lifetime you will see some rather sophisticated laws being written to accommodate these advances in technology, and I think it's not only interesting because I like to see the technological advances, but I also think it's interesting because the ethical implications. One final word is that you must understand the foundations of the constitutional rights invoked and the constitutional rights that are guaranteed throughout the entire process. As those situations and contexts get more advanced and more technological in their savvy, it doesn't detract from the robust constitutional rights that people have. So trying to interpret the Constitution in a modern context is difficult work, and so there's a lot of room here to discuss. There's a lot of things to think about, so I hope that you will do all of that as you work your way through this final module.